Hey, everybody. Uh, Thank you all for joining us tonight. It is 7:01, so I'm 60 seconds late, but we're going to go ahead and kick it off. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are going to spend the next hour, give or take, talking about offshore wind in Maryland. We're really excited about this webinar to get people re-energized for this issue in our state because we are at a really, really critical decision-making juncture for Maryland's offshore wind projects. And I'm excited to have everybody on. I'm excited to share this event and evening with our speakers. And with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is David Smedick. I'm with the Beyond Coal campaign of the Sierra Club here in Maryland. I'm going to provide a very short introduction tonight, go over the agenda, and then introduce our speakers, at which point we will have folks from League of Conservation Voters, National Wildlife Federation, the Business Network for Offshore Wind. They're going to go through some really exciting stuff for the offshore wind industry here in Maryland and explain how you guys can get involved as residents in our great state. So I've got a PowerPoint shared that hopefully everybody can see. If you are having any technical difficulties, please do text into the chat box that we have set up here on our tech side. That chat box is also great for questions. We're going to have a whole bunch of time at the end of the webinar for question and answer. But if you have anything that pops up as we're talking, please do write into that chat box. And we've got two awesome tech guys here to help us out and relay the questions to us. So with that, I'm going to provide a short agenda overview. What we're going to go through today is pretty straightforward. We're not getting heavy into the details of Public Service Commission politics or anything too major about super detailed policy things, but ask those questions if you have them. We're going to talk about what offshore wind is. We're going to talk about what it means for Maryland and what's happening in Maryland right now. And we're going to do that in two different ways. We're going to talk about the history of offshore wind in Maryland, a great campaign that many of you were probably a part of in around 2012, 2013. And then we're going to go back to why is this important right now? Why are we having a webinar tonight? Why are we asking everybody to get re-engaged in this issue? And then closing with what can you actually do to help us ensure that we get a project in Maryland and get turbines in the water. So we're going to do that with the speakers that I mentioned earlier. We have three awesome speakers that have been working on this issue for years and years. And we have Liz Burdock from the Business Network for Offshore Wind. Liz is really into this issue, as you can tell by the title of her organization. She knows a lot of the great context here, and she's going to give us some great intel. We have Jen Myhills from the National Wildlife Federation. Jen is providing a lot of the history for offshore wind in Maryland in terms of the campaign that she was an integral part of with the Maryland Climate Coalition back in 2013. And Carla Rettig with the Maryland League of Conservation Voters is really active in the issue as well and was back when we passed legislation. And she's going to close us out with what you guys can do to help us out and get the projects approved. And as we close everything else out, then we'll have that question and answer period. So at this point, I'm actually going to turn it over to Liz Burdock with the Business Network for Offshore Wind. And she's going to give that nice general overview of what the offshore wind industry is, what the technology is, and then she's going to hand it off to Jen. So Liz, you're up. So I'm just going to unmute you and we're going to kick it off.
Thanks, David. I hope everybody can hear me. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And
Liz, you're unmuted.
I am. Can you? Hi. Thanks, David. Can you hear me now? Am I good?
Yes.
Okay. So it's a pleasure to be here and to participate in this webinar. Just a few quick words about the Business Network. We are a 501c3 organization. We are solely focused on offshore wind. Our mission is to develop the U.S. offshore wind supply chain. We are a membership-based organization, and we work to accomplish our mission through education, partnering, and issue-based working groups that focus on removing the barriers to commercial-scale offshore wind development. So what is offshore wind? In the simplest terms, it's clean energy power plants in the ocean. It's essentially utility-scale renewable energy. that we take the basic concept of an onshore turbine and place it into the sea. So what happens is it becomes a marine construction project. There's a couple points I'd like to make about offshore wind in the industry as a whole. This is a real industry. It's by no means speculative. It's proven. Europe has over 12 gigawatts or 12,000 megawatts of offshore wind capacity installed, as you can see on your screen. Actually, today, I think it's really sort of interesting. The first offshore wind project that was ever built, Vinby, in 1991, was actually decommissioned today. It was 11 turbines that were built, and the reason why it was decommissioned was not because it had problems, but because of efficiency. During its entire lifetime, Vinby produced 243 gigawatts of power. This now corresponds to what the seven of the largest offshore wind turbines today can produce in a single year. Vinby had covered the annual power consumption of around 2,200 households. And in comparison, Dong Energy's future offshore wind farm off the coast of England, Hornsea Project 1, which will be the largest offshore wind farm, is able to supply green energy to approximately 1 million households. So that's how far we have come with offshore wind and the efficiency. And with that efficiency, our costs have fallen dramatically. In 7 years, we've seen a 72% cost reduction. And since we passed the Maryland Offshore Wind Energy Act, which you'll hear a little bit about later on, costs have dropped an additional 32%. So that's really huge. And the latest strike price, meaning contract price out of Europe that we saw on November 9th, actually reached 5.5 cents a kilowatt hour, which is $55 per megawatt hour. So in Europe, we are starting to see parity with solar, onshore wind, and even natural gas. And we believe that there's a huge potential here in the US to bring some of those lessons learned over and construct the 2,000 gigawatts of technical potential for offshore wind on our coastline that DOE estimates. This is a huge opportunity for us. It will create over 100,000 jobs. But even right now, with the cost dropping, what we've seen in the US is that there is now a market for offshore wind of 4 to 5 gigawatts. And we can equate that to essentially supporting 75,000 jobs on the Northeast Pipeline. So with that, I think I am supposed to turn it over to, Carla, correct? And she's going to talk a little bit about what is happening in Maryland.
This is Jen Meyer from the National Wildlife Federation, and I'm actually going to take it over from Liz and talk a little bit about what happened in Maryland to get us to this point, and kind of the history of the work that the Maryland Climate Coalition, National Wildlife Federation, and some of our other partners have done with many of you all over the last few years. So I'm actually going to start taking us back all the way to 2010, when two things were really starting to happen that set the stage for the development of offshore wind in Maryland, as well as many other places along the Atlantic coast. There was an effort by the federal government to actually begin leasing offshore wind energy areas. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, under the Federal Department of the Interior, actually leases these sites for development, and began a process with working with the states along the Atlantic coast, as well as many other stakeholders, to begin leasing those areas. And Maryland was one of those states that was really in the early leasing stages. Also, states like Maryland had started passing legislation to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and address the impacts of climate change. For example, Maryland had just passed the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act in 2009 and was really looking for strategies to help meet those robust goals that had been set to reduce climate emissions and really set the stage for what was next in terms of having good environmental energy policies for the state. States like Maryland also knew that those states that went first in the offshore wind industry would really become the hubs for jobs and for job creation, and would really be the leaders of a new developing industry in the US. So in 2010, a number of organizations that represented environmental interests, civic groups, faith groups, labor, all came together with a shared interest in offshore wind development in Maryland and formed the Maryland Climate Coalition. Many of you worked with us over a 3-year campaign to bring offshore wind to the state that included tens of thousands of petition signatures, phone calls, handwritten letters, rallies, even an effort to encircle the State House with bodies holding glowing wind turbines. So through all of that effort, we were able to pass the Maryland Offshore Wind Energy Act of 2013, which really set the stage for where we are today and the opportunity that we have to move forward. Throughout the campaign, we saw that Marylanders really do support offshore wind, really by a very strong margin of almost 4-to-1. Polling that we did through the campaign and even repeated as recently as last year demonstrates that there's broad support for offshore wind across all political parties and in all regions of the state. So I want to talk a little bit about what the Offshore Wind Energy Act of 2013 does, what the legislation says, and kind of what's next in the process. So the legislation really is focused on the financing mechanism for offshore wind. It puts in place what is called an offshore wind renewable energy credit, or you might heard it referred to as an OREC. So the legislation requires the Maryland Public Service Commission to begin a process of reviewing applications or OREC applications by offshore wind developers. The Public Service Commission is really the entity that reviews those applications and makes a decision to approve or deny a project. So the PSC, or the Public Service Commission, is a really critical component to the next stage of development in offshore wind in Maryland. The law actually outlines the criteria that the Public Service Commission needs to use in its evaluation of applications from offshore wind developers. And it looks at a couple of things. First, looking at net benefits. Those are environmental benefits, economic benefits, and public health benefits in the state. It also places a particular emphasis on manufacturing and in-state manufacturing employment, the extent to which developers engage with small businesses. And they also look at other employment impacts in the state. The Public Service Commission is also going to be looking at the lowest cost potential for offshore wind and the ratepayer impact. The law set basically a strike zone for the ratepayer impact so that it could not exceed $1.50 per month for the average household. The Public Service Commission is also going to be looking at potential reduction in what's called congestion prices for offshore wind. Looking at siting and project feasibility, a project has to be between 10 and 30 nautical miles off the coast of Maryland. And it'll also be looking at developers that make a serious good faith effort to engage minority investors in a project. The original legislation included a $10 million offshore wind business development fund that was really targeted at small and minority-owned businesses and assisting them in preparing to participate in this new industry. So the Public Service Commission is beginning that process now, and so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Carla Reddig to talk to Liz Burdock, I'm sorry. So we'll turn it back over to Liz to talk a little bit about what's happening at the Public Service Commission now.
Thanks, Jen. So as Jen mentioned, we are in the middle of the PSC approval process. 2 developers have submitted applications for review. The 2 developers are competing for the financing, the OREC that Jen mentioned. Those 2 developers are US Wind and a company called Skipjack, which is a subsidiary of Deepwater Wind, which happened to build the first offshore wind project that we now have in the United States, which is a 30 megawatt project in state waters off the coast of Rhode Island. US Wind is asking Maryland ratepayers to finance a 248 megawatt portion of their 750 megawatt total project. It is at a cost of $1.49 to ratepayers, which falls within that strike price that Jen referred to. Deepwater Wind is asking that the ratepayers finance a 120 megawatt project for a cost of 34 cents a month to ratepayers. I do want to emphasize this, that no money is charged to ratepayers until the projects are built and generating electricity. So until that point, we say the turbines are spinning, there will not be any fees charged to ratepayers. Both applicants cite various job numbers, which are currently being reviewed. I will not go into each one of their job numbers, but what I am comfortable with stating is that each project will create 1,000 jobs during the construction phase and 100 to 125 O&M jobs over the lifetime of the project, which is projected to be 20 years. Those are numbers that are used traditionally in Europe, so we're very comfortable with those numbers, and those are direct FTEs, and they do not count the secondary and tertiary jobs and economic benefit that's counted off of these projects. I do, however, want to go back to the 4 to 5 gigawatt Northeast pipeline and the 75,000 jobs that will be generated through that pipeline. As I mentioned, we have commitments from Massachusetts down to Maryland, and New York and Massachusetts states have both committed to supporting offshore wind development. But Maryland is poised to capture a significant portion of these jobs in this Northeast regional offshore wind pipeline if Maryland approves its own offshore wind project. And I really cannot stress enough that it is really contingent upon Maryland approving its own project. We can use the ports that are in the state, businesses, and a workforce to assemble the heavy steel components, which are the foundations, the transition pieces. The foundations are the steel components that are underneath the water, and the transition pieces are the yellow pieces that hold the tower in place, along with, and then the nacelle and the blades. And those can be manufactured here in the state, along with cables, crew, transfer vessels, and the state can become a main supply hub for the entire U.S. East Coast. But our state faces stiff competition, as these other states, such as New York and Massachusetts, are committed and interested in developing their own offshore wind projects. And the reasons for that are obviously the cost coming down so that they can meet their RPS standards, but also the jobs that are generated off of this. They also want those jobs. We had a recent development with offshore wind today. North Carolina, the wind energy area off the coast of North Carolina was actually auctioned and leased by BOEM, similar to the same process that Maryland went through that Jen talked about. And it was leased for $9 million in a state where there is no legislation. So this is showing the confidence of the market by European utility firms that are coming in and buying these wind energy areas to develop offshore wind. So it's good news for the industry, but it's also good news for Maryland, because again, we can be that hub for the East Coast, because where the infrastructure goes into place and where the first companies are set up is where the base for where the rest of the industry is going to be served. The PSC approval will lay the foundation for Maryland to be first in line to support offshore wind farms and all the jobs that it can bring to the local economy. And as it considers both of these applications, it is by no means a done deal. So your support is very important. And with that, I'll turn it over to Carla about how you can help, because your voice is needed in this process.
Thanks, Liz. And I'm Carla Rettig with the Maryland League of Conservation Voters. And so happy to be with you here tonight. I was with many of you in 2013 on the successful legislative campaign, which you've heard about tonight. It brought together labor, environmental community, the business community, faith community, and we all came together and we passed legislation, and now it's time to tell the Public Service Commission that Marylanders want steel in the water. So what we need here tonight is for you to take action. And I'm going to tell you the things that you can do to help us get the offshore wind off the ground. But before that, I just want to remind you that if you have a question, which we're going to go to after I'm done talking about how you can help, it would be great if you could go to the chat box at the bottom of your screen and type it in, and then we'll be able to answer your questions and really have a good conversation about offshore wind. First, what you can do is you can sign online petitions. We are going to be delivering these hard copies to the Public Service Commission in early April, and we need as many supportive signatures as possible. You can see on your screen where you can sign these petitions. Please do take advantage of this, and we will make sure that your voice is heard at the Public Service Commission. Second, please come to public hearings that the Public Service Commission is hearing. They're gonna have one in Berlin, Maryland on March 25th at the Stephen Decatur Middle School. Eastern Shore residents have an opportunity to make sure their voice is heard in support of offshore wind. And beginning at 6 p.m. on March 30th, the second public hearing will take place in Annapolis in the joint hearing room in the Department of Legislative Services building right next to the State House in Annapolis. And many of you probably participated in encircling the Capitol, and now you can take that one step further and tell the Public Service Commission you support offshore wind. We need as many people to turn out at these hearings as possible. It is a great opportunity for you to tell the Public Service Commission to act for Maryland. Finally, third, actually, you can write letters to the editor. When you see an article in the paper about energy or climate change, you have the opportunity to write a very short 150-word response to the paper expressing your desire for offshore wind in Maryland. The more people that read about this, the better, because the more people that read about it will result in more people signing the online petition and more people turning out at the public hearings. So please let your voice be heard in the press. Finally, tell your friends. Back in 2013, the push to get offshore wind in Maryland was so popular, and we needed folks to know that this is truly a popular program that Maryland needs to be ahead of. And now you need to tell the Public Service Commission, as well as everyone, your friends, your neighbors, that offshore wind can come to Maryland. It's good for the economy, and it's good for the environment. So with that, I hope you get involved. And please, if you have questions, chat them, and I'm going to turn it back over to David Smedick, who will be moderating the question portion.
Great. All right, thank you, Carla, and thank you to everybody else that spoke tonight. This was a good conversation. We went through a lot of information, somewhat quickly, but that's because we want to respect your time. So we're going to open up the Q4 questions now. We've got some stuff filing into the chat box. We'll get to that as our tech folks sort them out and start lining them up for us to ask. But for moderator's privilege, which is myself, I'm going to ask the first question. I'm going to direct it to Jen Myhills to ask her about wildlife impacts associated with offshore wind. As a Sierra Club employee, I get a lot of questions about how wind turbines affect wildlife, and in particular, people are now asking how offshore wind turbines might affect wildlife. So I'm going to let Jen answer that question because she's got a lot of good information on it.
Great, thanks, David. And this is a really important question that folks have. So at first, I'd like to start to say that every source of energy has the potential to impact wildlife, whether it's wind turbines or solar panels or fossil fuel extraction. There are impacts no matter the type of energy that we develop. But I think the most important thing here is making smart decisions about the type of energy that we develop and make sure that they're appropriately cited. Clearly, the biggest impact to wildlife is the impact of climate change. It is the single greatest threat facing wildlife and their habitats. And urgently curbing the greenhouse gas emissions that are caused by burning fossil fuels and transitioning to clean renewable sources of energy like offshore wind are one of the best ways that we can make sure that we restore healthy wildlife populations. Through the experience in Europe, we've seen that offshore wind can be operated in a manner that has not demonstrated any long-term or significant impacts to wildlife. We also know that if we're thinking about birds and bats in particular, as people are thinking about wind turbines, the further offshore we go, the fewer number of birds that we see and the fewer types of species of birds that we see. Bats are primarily land-based, and so we see very few species offshore, and those that are offshore fly well below the sweep of the turbine blades. So as an organization that cares deeply about wildlife and is concerned about wildlife and its habitats, the National Wildlife Federation really views offshore wind as one of the best ways that we can protect wildlife by addressing the impacts of climate change and doing it in a way that's smart and safe and sited appropriately in the right locations off the coast. So I'll turn it back over to David for next questions.
So our next question here is, so Deepwater Wind's Delaware project some years back was derailed in part by NIMBY objections over the siting of the underground cable needed to link the farm to the grid. Is the siting of cables to bring power onshore in Maryland already known, or is this a potential future fight similar to what happened in Delaware? Is that a good question for Liz to answer? So Liz, you're unmuted. Do you have a good answer to that question about cables?
Sure, I can take that. Yes,
Thank you.
The sites are known. Deepwater Wind's cable will come into Ocean City. It will come in, and I could have this wrong, but it's either the 124th or the 128th substation. So there should not be a fight over that cable coming in onshore. The U.S. Wind cable will go into Delaware, actually, into the Indian River substation. So those two things have been decided, and it does not seem like as if there will be a NIMBYism fight or objections over either one of those cables.
Great, thank you. And maybe another question for you, Liz, does the PTC tax credit for wind apply to these offshore facilities?
Yes. Well, the PTC, it's actually the ITC, the investment tax credit applies to these two facilities. Given the long time it takes to construct an offshore wind facility, the ITC is more appropriate for offshore wind. However, as many of you know, that the ITC is ratcheting down and expiring. So that's why it is of extreme importance that the projects are approved on May 17th. That is the PSC deadline for to make a decision, because if it is approved in that time frame, it will qualify for the higher ITC rate, and again helping to offset costs to the ratepayers.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Liz, and great question there too. This is David again. I just wanted to chime in as we're queuing up the next question. If folks are interested in attending the hearings or testifying at the hearings that Carla mentioned, I believe that Dan Fermansky has put in the chat box links to the registration pages for those hearings. That will help us know that you're interested in attending, and if you may want to speak at the hearing, we can provide you a couple talking points. It'd be great for us to get a record of those of you that are interested. So please visit those registration pages that Dan has linked to.
And folks, we'll be sending you an email tomorrow. My name's Seth Bush. I'm an organizer with the Maryland Climate Coalition. So you'll be getting an email from me tomorrow. I already have your email address for when you registered for this webinar. You'll get a recording of this webinar, as well as links to the petition and links to sign up for the hearings themselves, and even there will be carpool information in there as well. So if you're thinking you wouldn't be able to get to the hearing for lack of a ride, we'll help you set those up, make sure you can get there. We'll also help you make sure you have all the information that you need to testify. So we got another question here from Lynn Parsons. An objection from the environmental community is the impact on migratory birds. I was at an Audubon lecture by Don Messersmith, and he said, "Don't get me started." I was being interrupted during the discussion, can you confirm that these turbines will be located where migrations are not likely to be impacted? Jen, I'm going to unmute you here.
Great. Thanks, Seth. So obviously we are very concerned about whether it's migratory birds or migratory marine mammals like the North Atlantic right whale. So working to make sure that the offshore wind energy areas are sited in locations that provide the least conflicts with wildlife. So where we see the most conflicts, particularly with migratory species, are in the nearshore environment, shoals, inlets, opening to the bay. The offshore wind energy area is at least 10 miles off the coast. So as I said before, we see fewer species of birds there. Those species that of seabirds and waterfowl that we do find offshore tend to migrate either above the sweep of the wind turbine or below the sweep of the wind turbine. So I can't guarantee that there will be absolutely zero, never a single species that would ever be impacted by a wind turbine. But as an organization that cares deeply about wildlife, we feel that the best approach is being taken in terms of siting the project responsibly and making sure that we are minimizing any potential impact on wildlife.
Great, thank you. Another question here from Dave High. One of the projects appears to be off the coast of Delaware. Is this site more of an exclusive Delaware project or a joint project with Delaware and Maryland? Liz, I think that's another question for you. Can you take a shot at that?
Sure. So both sites are in federal waters. And yes, one is more directly off the coast of Maryland, the U.S. Wind site, and the other is more directly off the coast of Delaware. But again, I remind you that these are both federal sites, federal leased areas. So no, it is not a project of Delaware, and no, it is not a Delaware, Maryland project. It is a project that is located in the Delaware wind energy area, and it is being financed through a Maryland OREC financing mechanism because the economic benefits and the renewable benefits that are derived from the project are going to be allocated towards Maryland.
Great, thanks, Liz. I got another 2 questions for you. One from Valerie Hartman, what about hurricanes? And Valerie, we're gonna get to the other part of your question in a second, but first question is, what about hurricanes? And Liz, the second question for you from Andrew Hines in Baltimore is, could the PSC award both projects?
So I'll start with the hurricane question. We get asked this a lot, and there's increasingly more studies being done. However, the technology that is used for the foundations is a oil and gas technology. The one that is proposed by U.S. Wind is a twisted jacket foundation. Also, the one that's used by Deepwater in their Block Island project is a twisted jacket foundation. The twisted jacket foundation is a direct outgrowth of the oil and gas industry, which, as we all know, there are too many oil and gas platforms off the coast of Texas and Louisiana, and they withstand hurricanes repeatedly. So NREL is the National Renewable Energy Laboratory that is studying all of this, is very comfortable with the foundations, with them being able to withstand high winds. So we don't see a problem with hurricanes. Also, the North Sea sees some very large and ferocious storms with high winds. So the turbines weather those storms extremely well. There's no problems with them. So we do not see hurricanes as being an issue. The second question about whether or not the PSC could award both applicants, that is a possibility. One of the commissioners in the hearing today asked about that, if they could apportion a certain amount of the OREC financing to one project and apportion another amount to the other project. So the answer is yes, and the PSC commissioners are at least thinking along those lines. So there is that possibility. There's the possibility that only one project gets funded. There's a possibility that both of them or some portion of both of them get funded, and also the possibility that none of them get funded. So those are our three scenarios.
Great. Thank you, Jen. Liz, I'm sorry. We got the second part of, I believe, Valerie's question is for Jen Myhills again. Is there any necessary precautions for marine life where these turbines are situated? Jen?
Thanks. That's a great question as well. So when we think about other marine life, like marine mammals, whether they're whales or dolphins or other marine life like sea turtles, the types of things that we are looking for are a couple. One, potentially some seasonal restrictions on when projects are constructed, if that's a time of year when the North Atlantic right whale, for example, might be migrating through the mid-Atlantic. We also look at things, and developers are required to have observers on their vessels that are out there installing turbines to make sure that a whale or sea turtles aren't swimming into the area. There's also restrictions on how fast those boats can travel to avoid and minimize any potentials for boat collisions with wildlife, and using the best available technology to reduce any impacts from sound from the installation of the platforms that Liz had been describing. So there are a lot of best management practices that we know of that can help us to minimize any potential impacts to wildlife. And then, as I mentioned, having some restrictions on the times of year when some of the work is done has also been useful in protecting some of the wildlife that's most sensitive.
Great. Thank you, Jen. Liz, I got another question for you from John Steiner. Are there advantages to offshore wind versus land-based wind? Bigger turbines, better winds, or better ability to cost-effectively deliver power?
So obviously there's advantages to both onshore and offshore wind, but the offshore wind turbines are much larger. We're looking at 8 megawatt turbines now in Europe, going up to 10 megawatts. The efficiency on the turbines is much greater than it even was in the older offshore wind turbines. There are also better wind resources at sea, so that helps with the wind efficiency as well as constant production of wind of energy. So the variable of the wind at offshore is not as great.
Great, thank you, Liz. If you don't mind, have yet another really good question for you. What would be the long-term price impact to ratepayers if either of both of these projects is constructed and brought online? Would the average bill go up, down, or stay flat? That's from Grant Sams over at Washington College.
So as Jen mentioned, in the Maryland Offshore Wind Energy Act, there was a cap put on the legislation to the ratepayers. It's $1.50. So it cannot go, the rate on the ratepayer cannot exceed $1.50. So regardless if they approve both projects, it has to fall within that $1.50 cap.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from folks? Oop, got a couple good ones come in. What resistance have you encountered and how have you responded? Who's that a good question for? David? All right, I'm gonna unmute you here.
Yeah, that's a great question. Sorry, we had some feedback as I started talking. It is a great question. So the resistance that we've seen, I think, is primarily around the price point that the previous question alluded to, but we crafted that compromise through the legislation after, as Jen mentioned, a number of years. And so as each year progressed on that legislative campaign, we saw, we always saw some resistance, but we saw less and less as we crafted that compromise. We got more people on board and more people excited about the opportunity. So I think that the price point is usually a question for people, but as we explain it to them and share the benefits, we we feel very confident that the net benefit test that's in that legislation shows how valuable these kinds of projects can be. So I would assume that that's the most resistance that I've seen, but as you get to explain the opportunity associated with this technology and the opportunity that Liz mentioned in terms of becoming an industry hub, the benefits seem to outweigh any concerns that or questions people have about the cost up front. The other cool thing that I like to see click in people's minds is when you talk about wind, including offshore wind, you get to move past the volatile price scenarios associated with fossil fuels. So you'll see the price of coal and gas fluctuate all the time, and that's what you're constantly feeding to dirty power plants. But with wind, once you put the turbines up, the wind keeps blowing. And then you just have the operation costs associated with it and the maintenance costs. So the fuel certainty and the fuel cost reductions are really exciting. And that's always fun to see people come around on.
Great. Thank you, David. So we have a good question in here. Actually, two questions, I think, for you again, Liz. Sorry, we keep putting you on the spot here. First one's pretty straightforward, and then I'll read the second one. Approximately how many households or businesses do we expect these turbines would generate energy for? And the second one is a little bit trickier. U.S. Wind has said that they have problems with high voltage terminations. What is the potential for local cable splicing experts to take part in this project? This is from longtime BGE employee over in Turner Station, Larry Bannerman, who's been doing some great work over there. So what is the potential for local cable splicing experts to take part in this project, and approximate businesses and households these turbines would serve?
So as I recall, we estimated that the 250 megawatt offshore wind project would power all of the households and businesses within Baltimore City. That exact number eludes me right now, but that gives you a sense of the size of the project that U.S. Wind is talking about. Obviously, the Skipjack project is a little bit smaller than that, about half the size of it. So you can extrapolate from that what we're talking about. As far as the local workforce, this is a really great question. It really is, and we are always in the offshore wind industry looking for local talent and looking to employ the local workforce into projects for various reasons. One being that it really does help reduce the overall cost of offshore wind. Having said that, there is obviously nuances to the industry, and you have to be able to work offshore, as these are marine construction projects and power plants in the sea, so you have to be able to go offshore. So where we can work together to get local workers trained and qualified to work on these projects, we absolutely will. And that is the role that the network plays. That's why we were created. It was really to help bridge the gap between U.S. workers and U.S. businesses to make sure that they could participate in the offshore wind supply chain and have the opportunities. So we bridge the gap with education, training, and would love to work with you and helping you meet the right people so that you can go out to sea and work on these projects.
Thanks for that, Liz. Thanks for both of those answers. I got another question for you too, from Alfred Bartlett. Are there good estimates of the savings to ratepayers from reduction of congestion charges on the Eastern Shore, and also from reduced capacity charges Maryland pays for imported electricity? Good question.
So the answer is yes, but I don't have those with me right now. If we could capture these, David, and potentially get back to you on those. Each one of the developers has obviously done an analysis of that, and I'd be more than happy to get that information and share it with you. But I don't have it at my fingertips right now.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. We're definitely capturing all the questions. I put that one on you because I didn't remember the exact number either, and was hoping that you might have remembered, but we'll certainly get that to folks because they have analyzed it and are looking at that as one of the big benefits. I did see another question in the chat box that I don't have a specific answer for either, because it's variable, but I will try to speak to a little bit. There was a question about what time frame we can be looking at for a project to be up and operating after a PSC decision. And I'm going to kind of talk around an exact answer, because it's definitely dependent on the project itself. So, it certainly won't be in 2018 that the thing comes up and starts putting electrons onto the grid, but we're hoping that the sooner we can get the PSC decision, the sooner we can get the turbines in the water. So it will take a couple of years for it to get up and running, but we do need this decision to happen this spring so that we can actually accelerate that timeline. The companies have put a certain amount of investment into the studying and the initial outlook into the sites and modeling for what their projects can do and the benefits that can be associated with them. So they are invested in the area and are ready to hit the ground running should their project be approved, but they're not going to have everything ready the exact second that they can't have invested too much, or they run the risk of getting shot down and losing a lot of money. So they're ready to move, but they just need that PSC decision, and it just depends on which project is finally selected. Sorry, that's a roundabout answer.
And David, can you say any words about what Exelon's stance is on offshore wind? Or is that a question for Liz or somebody else?
I don't have a specific answer to that. And I'm seeing the other folks I'm with shaking their heads. So unless Liz has a response to that, we are not sure what Exelon's stance is.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So it's my understanding that Exelon is monitoring the offshore wind industry, looking at the cost. They do have an above all strategy according to their spokespersons. And I will say this, that at this point, they are not intervening against the project in the PSC process.
Great. Thank you, Liz. Very clear. And can you also expound a little bit on what the infrastructure improvements that will be needed associated with the offshore wind?
Yes. There are actually a lot of infrastructure port improvements that will be needed in order to support this project, also relating to a lot of onshore construction jobs. Specifically, the pier sides will need to be upgraded to increase their strength. These are large components and they're heavy components, so pier side strength needs to be increased. There are a lot of other technical improvements that have to be done as well. Also, cranes have to be installed. So we actually have an article on this. So if you want, I can certainly send that around to you, and you can review the article on the technical improvements that need to be made in order to support offshore wind from a port infrastructure standpoint.
Great, thanks, Liz. This is David again. I'm actually going to start wrapping up. I think it was a really good conversation. Some great questions were asked. Feel free to respond to the email that we send tomorrow with any additional questions you may have. I can't promise exact answers, but we will do our best to get you some resources and answers to those questions. So I wanted to start my 2-minute wrap up by sincerely thanking our speakers tonight. We threw a lot of information out there, and you guys had a lot of really good, tough questions. So thank you to Carla, thank you to Jen, thank you to Liz for taking time out of your evening tonight and sharing this space with us. And then thank you to everybody on the actual webinar. I know it's always tricky for people to take time out of their nights and to have these kinds of discussions. I think it's really exciting to have this many people on with us. And we're really, really excited to take this next step over the next 2 months at the PSC to get a project approved for Maryland. A reminder that this is no guarantee. We need the PSC to actually make a decision. We believe that the law is there for them to follow, and they should approve a project, but it's still up in the air. We need to make sure that people understand at the PSC how excited Maryland residents are for offshore wind, how much we believe we need it, and how much we want to be the industry hub for this exciting new center of opportunity in the energy sector for our state and our country. So reminder, please fill out the online petitions, share them on social media, share them via email with your friends. We will be hand delivering those comments to the Public Service Commission in the beginning of April. So we need to get as many people weighing in as possible. And then please come out, if you're on the Eastern Shore tonight, come out to Berlin, Maryland on Saturday, March 25th at noon. If you're in the other part of the state and in the central region of the state, please come out to Annapolis on Thursday evening at 6 o'clock, March 30th. We really want to pack the rooms and tell the commissioners and the PSC staff that we want offshore wind. So please RSVP for that. Please come out and please continue engaging, because we really want to get these turbines up and we want to make Maryland a leader on this issue. So with that, I appreciate everybody's time, and we're going to close off. Look for an email and send us any questions.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.